billions of people all of a sudden being able to transfer value digitally. It's very exciting times. From pipes to platforms, So telcos have moved now beyond just connectivity with very simple services of sending money using USSD wallets to become financial services enablers. And that's built up a lot of trust. And very simply put, using the telco, airtime has become a currency,
Yeah.
So if you think of that next thing, if I have to move on from that, airtime as a currency, trust has become a currency. And that trust as a currency has been driven by mobile devices, the data that you get off those mobile devices, the behavior that you're seeing on those mobile devices, which is significant. So the telcos have built that trust. They're driving financial inclusion. Telcos are renting out their network or eSIMs that can be used specifically for either financial services or can be offered by these financial services companies, basically as a means to, acquire customers. What's going to happen in the future? Potentially, maybe a big bank will say, hey, I'm going to set up my own telco.
Yeah.
And actually what you see in Africa, the big telcos are actually setting up their own financial services, their own fintech companies. There is space for alternative payment networks. And that's a very interesting space that we may be moving into.
Welcome to Rewired. This is a Pantrium miniseries where we dive deeper into how technology has evolved over the past 25 years and what that transformation means for people, businesses, and this next wave of change driven by AI. And with me today is With me today, I have Michael Wallis-Brown from FIS. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Christie. Sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful. My English ancestors decided to put many names in there, but thank you for having me, Christie. I appreciate it.
Of course. I've been looking forward to it. We connected on LinkedIn a while back, and we had a really good conversation, and I thought I have to bring you on due to your background. So before we go into it, Michael, can you just introduce yourself to the listeners?
Yeah, thank you, Christine. I really appreciate the opportunity. As I said, my name is Michael Wallis-Brown. I was born and bred in Cape Town, South Africa. So I come from that part of the world. But for the last 20 years or so, I've worked internationally, starting off in Singapore and Australia with the IBM Software Group, then with Nokia mobile phones in Singapore, and then at the headquarters in Finland, where I looked after their applications business, which led me into mobile payments in those days. Then I had some experience with a couple of really great startups, one of them being Prove.com, which is one of the leaders in digital identity, that had an investment from Verizon, the largest mobile carrier in the US, and also American Express, and there's also Early Warning. So some of the major players in the US market. That was very interesting times and the early days of digital identities. And then a couple of other startups, but also then I looked after Ericsson's mobile financial services business, which basically is one of the largest mobile wallet providers in the world, with about 450 million registered users and about 130 million day active users across 24 markets globally, which is very, very interesting in terms of that convergence of telcos and fintech. And I was lucky enough to join FIS. And FIS is, of course, most people will know, one of the largest fintechs in the world. They provide technology to some of the largest banks, or around about, I would say over 50% of the largest banks and central banks around the world, both in banking and payments, but then also in capital markets or all the trading platforms. So they move money across the world, in the trillions of dollars, and is one of the major players in banking and payments. So I've been very lucky in that sense, Christie, and I've worked in global roles and internationally. But of course, I'm very passionate about mobile payments and how we see this orchestration layer with the mobile playing a really important part in driving adoption of payments and banking services around the world. So it's very exciting times.
That is exactly what we're going to talk about today. So that's also why I thought you would be the perfect guest for this episode, where we're going to talk about exactly this crosswire between mobile, telco, fintech, access to mobile banking and so forth. And we're going to talk about this evolution of telco and how we see that we're moving from perhaps a utility enabler to more of a foundational focus and force in this digital finance and global innovation. And again, with your experience and insights, I think we can have a really strong conversation around that. And again, like how are we seeing financial services and super apps and this chat-based commerce changing the way, and what does then trust, inclusion, and innovation mean in all of this? So if you're ready, I'm ready to dive in.
Let's do that. Where should we start? It's such a broad topic. At the end of the day, everyone should look at what they hold in their hands today. And that's the really interesting part of the story. It's this mobile device that has moved from making telephone calls wirelessly and sending SMS messages over a mobile network to now this device that is a very, very powerful computer that connects to a data network that's got speed. You can stream music, you can stream multimedia, and you can then pay for things. So you can both pay for things and services on that device or in that mobile ecosystem. But now you can also use that device literally as a point of sale, to make payments very simple and easy. And most people on this call today who are listening would have made a transaction using Apple Pay or Google Pay, digital wallets that, make payments through that mechanism really, really simple.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it as that as a starting point. Everyone should have that user experience on a mobile device today, but it's been a long journey to get to that point. But it's also, there's some incredible opportunities opening up as this evolves, and it's evolving very quickly.
And the point that I also feel like, and hence also why this Rewired mini-series is this concept of like over the past 25 years, and as you said, we went from having mobile phones in our hands to call. And I actually just did a session in Finland recently, and I was talking about the Nokia, right, with Snake and the games and so on, right? And I got all nostalgic and was thinking about this. And I wanted to start with, Michael, to get your point and your thoughts on, as we're looking at from a .com or post.com area, where we would define probably about, disruption and how, the mobile area now is about speed and access and so forth. How would you describe what we are currently in when it comes to AI?
It's quite difficult to put it into one sentence, but, I think we could break it down, Christie. On the one hand, you've got these big emerging markets in Africa that are literally leapfrogging into a whole new way of accessing financial services and making payments. But then you've got the more sophisticated legacy environment where you've got the traditional banking and payments core, so the big banks, and then the payment rails, which are essentially driven by Visa, MasterCards of the world. And that's a very different world compared to those big emerging markets. But you brought up AI. What I will say to you is that AI is a bit of a buzzword, but what you find is that the mobile device, because it's in your hand the whole time, or the messaging services, whether it be WhatsApp or WeChat, they become much more trusted and personalized. So there's a much more personal feeling and trusted feeling of, banking and making transactions and paying with your mobile device. And what does that mean? Well, where there's going to be a significant revolution in financial services is what we call AI, powered by trust. So all the data credentials that you can get from a mobile environment, whether it be your phone, the IMSI, the IME, some people call it this device DNA, which brings in all that powerful data points from the device in your hand and your behavior on the device, the way you touch things and the way you manage that device. It's all tracked and managed. Okay. Then the networks that tracks your location and all sorts of other things. All those data points that come from your telco environment are now merging together with all the data that's coming from your traditional financial world or the financial environment. So it's really interesting how that is evolving. So, without making any predictions, what I will say to you is that the telco rails, so to speak, are now playing a very important part from that data perspective. So this AI-powered trust for me is really key. That can help with fraud detection. It can help with personalized financial services, credit scoring, all these kind of things all of a sudden become much more richer, and it's impacting what we do in the traditional world. What you also have, the other piece that I'd say there would be the super app convergence. The super app convergence, from my perspective, is really important. You can look at Gojek in Indonesia, and you can look at what's happening with MTN Momo in Africa, with these wallets integrating with messaging, commerce, payments, all these kinds of things. So MTN Momo in Africa is a really good case study. You've also got Paytm in India. These are huge, hundreds of millions of people that are now accessing financial services through telco apps, through these super apps, and all the data there that's driven there is creating, a significant advantage for them when you're trying to provide new sorts of financial services.
Yeah. And as you're talking about this very much around the super apps and how mobile become more of a device of payments and connectivity and that infrastructure that lays behind it because of the telco, I'm wondering, as we're again reflecting back on to the past 25 years and the evolution, what would you say that from your experience as well has been some of the biggest learnings from how telco became or moved from just SMS to now super apps? And is there something that the financial services and the fintech sector can take of inspiration in this intersection between, the two parallel worlds?
Yeah, well, I think what you see here, when you talk about telcos, you talk about big banks, payment ecosystems that come from the traditional first world markets. What you see is a balancing act. The learning has been a balancing act. I don't know if everyone remembers, those first transactions that we were doing on a mobile device was a service called Premium SMS. Premium SMS was, you wanted to buy that ringtone. If you remember the snake, you'd buy a ringtone, or you'd buy a little wallpaper that you'd put on your little, let's call it a dumb device in those days.
Yeah.
But you pay with a premium SMS service. And traditionally you could charge, $1, $5, those kinds of things. I remember those information services like Share Alert, or Horoscope Alert, or Weather Alert. You get a little SMS message, which is a premium service. Those are the early 2000s.
Now it's called notifications.
Or notifications. But I remember, when we did our startup, prove.com, you can go and look it up. We were actually doing that. And there were a whole lot of companies around that, Boku, etc., that were trying to merge this mobile space. For me, it is a balancing act between telcos and these regulated financial services. Regulation plays an enormously important role in the financial services space. We're dealing with people's money, we're dealing with people's deposits. Payments is one thing, and fraud is a huge thing in payments. Yeah. So without having the right regulations in place, things get very messy very quickly. So the biggest learning for me there was regulation and then how that's managed between the telco space and that premium SMS services. And then as we move into banking and payments. And in those days when we did Prove, the reason why we brought in American Express, for example, and then Verizon as investment partners, because we couldn't bridge that gap on the regulatory side. And what we saw there is that once you started using that data to do identity management, what we saw was we would have the mobile identity that came from actually hooking into the SS7 global roaming network that reconciled all the payments between the different telcos, and it would integrate into the APIs of the schemes or the banks to bring in that data. It needs to be done in a very tight, regulated environment, and that data was very valuable. And then it comes into the point there, it's partnership versus licensing, and how do you manage that environment? And I think what we see is telcos are in that space today. So you see Revolut, I think, has announced that it's doing, for travel services, and that's where you see it. So the MVNO space or the MVNE space for eSIMs, that's really important. So what you'll see is telcos are renting out their network or eSIMs that can be used specifically for either financial services or can be offered by these financial services companies, basically as a means to, acquire customers. Hey, sign up to our, get a Revolut card, or sign up to our banking service or our payment service. You get an eSIM, and that data service or that access to that telco network is part of the package of that financial service. But it's a partnership that they've done, or an MVNO or licensing that they've done. And you see that. So you see Nubank has done that in Brazil very successfully with Claro. And you're going to see more and more of that happening in different regions as the regulations and as the the kind of, let's call it conversion of these two players, come to fruition. And hey, what's going to happen in the future? Potentially, maybe a big bank will say, hey, I'm going to set up my own telco,
Yeah.
And actually what you see in Africa, the big telcos are actually setting up their own financial services, their own fintech companies. That's what Momo is doing. You see MasterCard has made a big investment into MTN Momo, and that's how it's playing out.
And with that, I wanted to stay on how the different regions are reacting and moving ahead. And as you were talking about both Africa and Asia, and you talked about Brazil and so on, there's so much conversation about Europe. And I feel like I have to ask you, from this game and this infrastructure play, where does Europe sit versus the rest of the world? Are we in Europe lacking behind, or what's your point of view there?
This is a really key question, Christie, and I need to be careful with what I say here because I don't want to be too strong in what I say. I'm going to keep it positive from the perspective that I think Europe has a huge opportunity. If you think that Europe has actually led, particularly, for example, countries like Finland and Sweden, where they essentially invented mobile networks and mobile phones,
Yes.
as everyone knows, there's an opportunity for Europe now as a market to do some significant things. You heard me mention regulation. I mean, I'm not going to go into all the different bits and pieces of regulation, but you've got telco regulation that I think today is very regionally focused. What I mean by that, I think it's one of the challenges that mobile networks or the mobile network business in Europe has, where the regulation is very regionally focused. So there's different regulation in France, there's different regulation in Germany, there's different regulation in Spain. That potentially could or should change. But then, of course, on the payments and banking side, there's regulation that governs a lot of things. I mean, whether it be on the credit card side or the payment space, whether it be on the banking side, there's regulation that covers a lot of things. So I think there are some challenges on the regulatory side, but I do see that things are starting to move. I think the US potentially with the new Genius Act has actually made a lot of people sit up and take notice. And the role of potentially stable coins and the role of digital currencies or either digital euro, that's one of the things, have made people sit up, and I think has made Europe sit up and think and say, okay, well, we need to get to act together. So on the positive side, I think in Europe, there is a huge opportunity. I think there are some challenges moving ahead. There is probably a much more detailed discussion we could go into on this.
Yes.
But from that perspective, what I do see is that it is starting to move. And with the Genius Act coming into play, and there are key players, both on the government side and regulatory side, but then also on the corporate side that are now starting to make some significant moves.
Yeah. You talked about fraud, personalized payments, and trust. I wanted to revert back to that for a moment because with your experience with global players, everything from Apple and Google and Facebook, I'm wondering, as we're looking at patterns and what the different players are doing in this space, what do you see needs to be done or being done when it comes to customers, the value that the customer gain from these platforms and the telco infrastructure? What can others take of inspiration from telco? And also, what do you see is important as we're moving into mobile banking and payments when it comes to this trust and the customer value?
So I think we could, if we just pivot to some of the experiences that are coming out of these giant emerging markets, whether it be India or whether it be Africa. If you look at some of the market mechanics, Christie, the next 2 billion people that are going to, let's say, be banked, if that's the right thing to say, coming out of Africa, that's a huge number. We're talking billions of people. So there's two things here. Telcos have built a reputation of trust, particularly consumer trust. And I think the key case study there is actually M-Pesa in Kenya. If you just think of what that did in East Africa when M-Pesa, was launched, it's significant. Even though M-Pesa was quite unique, because it was collusion between a bank and a telco. So Safaricom and then KCB, the Kenya Central Bank, colluded with that. And the reason why they colluded was to overcome those regulatory headwinds that they were feeling. But long story short, what M-Pesa has done in that market was to build an enormous level of trust for telcos, okay, versus banks. And I know that because I did a lot of work with Equity Bank. Equity Bank, you weren't even allowed to walk into the branches in Kenya if you were one of those, unbanked people.
Mm.
You needed to have a suit and a tie, look the part.
Wow.
That's how ridiculous it was. And even if you could get into the bank, you had to get over all sorts of hurdles to even open accounts, let alone get a loan. Okay.
Mm.
Now what you've seen is that whole environment has just been, I'm going to use a word, exploded,
Yeah.
and these telcos have now built that trust for the consumers, and actually they don't trust banks. So from that perspective, it's an inclusion driver too. So, wallets have become this tool of, remittances, cross-border payments. Use Kenya as an example. You could be working in the city in Kenya, but you were able to very quickly, send some money or walk to an agent, hand over some cash, and that gets sent via M-Pesa to your grandmother who's in a little village, across the country, on a dumb device. It's using USSD, okay, and very simple telco technology to make that transfer. That's now led to a whole lot of other really, really amazing applications. So what I talk about there is from pipes to platforms, So telcos have moved now beyond just connectivity with very simple services of sending money using USSD wallets, to become financial services enablers. And that's built up a lot of trust, and very simply put, using the telco, airtime has become a currency,
Yeah.
So if you think of that next thing, if I have to move on from that, airtime as a currency, trust has become a currency. And that trust as a currency has been driven by mobile devices, the data that you get off those mobile devices, the behavior that you're seeing on those mobile devices, which is significant. So the telcos have built that trust. They're driving financial inclusion, and that trust level brings us back to that AI story. What we're seeing is the really big players, whether it be the scaled up neobanks like Nubank and Revolut and these guys, as well as the really big banks, are seeing this mobile device and this mobile interaction as the trust currency that's now filtering into all the data points for financial services and payments.
I think that is really fascinating also from an infrastructure perspective, right? When you originally are thinking about payments, you're thinking about the payment rails, right? But to your point also, it goes way beyond that, and that it's not the only way to move money. And with also, as you said, about eSIMs, it leads me to a question around what do you think is the most misunderstood both challenges but also opportunities when it comes to this telco-based fintech products today?
I think it's not necessarily about misunderstanding it. I think what's driving it, if you look at the example of M-Pesa, for example, or let's use some other examples, MTN Momo, okay? It's sub-Saharan Africa. Let's use another example, EasyPesa in Pakistan. I think EasyPesa's got something like 50 million users. If you look at those examples, these are very basic connectivity driven by USSD. They're not even data networks, they're mobile networks. But the new financial layer there is the mobile wallet. So the wallet as the digital bank, okay? And they've become the de facto account for these billions of unbanked or underbanked people. So that's at that level, okay? So unbanked people, very, very dumb devices, okay, on USSD platforms, okay, doing very simple transactions and now having access to, everyday utility, basic payments. So, pay for your energy, pay for your milk, pay for your school fees. Now they get all of a sudden, oh, there's a little savings account based off that wallet. Okay. Now you can do a bit of credit. Okay. Now you can have some insurance. Okay. Based on your behavior and your scoring that are coming from those very basic stories. Okay. And even, investments are being embedded in the wallets. What do I mean by investments embedded in the wallets? From that perspective, you can make investments. You can buy a share in a goat, for example, or what you call them in South Africa, you call them stokvels, okay? Stokvels is where all the grannies sit around and they put their money in a hat. Now you can create a stokvel using a wallet. And, this is really, really, interesting stuff that's happening at that level, okay? But then you move it across to what's happening with digital wallets, Apple Pay and Google Pay. What you see there is not just adding a credit card in there, now been making a payment with Apple Pay and Google Pay. And I remember the day when we launched that in 2015 in Europe and how we did that. It was really interesting how that user behavior all of a sudden became, the new way of doing payments. And in those days, we called it in-app payments. So you can make a payment in your app or through your wallet. And nowadays, I don't know how I don't even carry my wallet around anymore with my card. I take my phone and everything's in there and I'm making payments. There are loyalty cards, loyalty points, and you can now pay with loyalty points. So the next step with that is those loyalty points, if you think about it, are almost like a digital currency. And you can take those loyalty points and you could pay with those loyalty points in a particular store. Let's call it Boots, okay? And potentially those ecosystems which are closed today, you can only spend those loyalty points in Boots. But hey, now you can spend those loyalty points with other merchants that you have a relationship with. You see that happening with airlines significantly. But what's the other piece that's going to happen there? Well, you can have not just loyalty points or loyalty cards that are in there, but you can have your identity. Your identity card is now stored in there, and you're going to be able to attach that identity card with your passport, with your latest bills from your card company or your utility company, because normally when you ask for credit or you ask for something, they ask you, please prove your identity by sending us 3 utility bills. So in the first world level, that user behavior now is coming to fruition too. And it's really interesting for me to see it's exactly the same user behavior that's coming out of a big emerging market. For some person sitting in a little village in the Rift Valley in Kenya, who's being asked to prove their identity. It's in a very similar manner through the digital wallet as this orchestration layer, okay, or this new financial layer where there's a behavior. These 3 people that proves their identity. Oh, and by the way, now you can get a little loan or something like that. So it's really interesting what's happening.
I think it's super interesting. The mobile device becomes almost this unified platform for everything that we're doing, and you're able to pay, and it will give you the transaction that will nudge behavior and, to your point, loyalty schemes and so forth, right? We talk about telco, and I wanted to hear about how do you see the likes of, Apple, Samsung, Google with their phones where they have the hardware. How do you see that will evolve over time? Because wouldn't they want a stake in that? I'm, with the whole ecosystem of how Apple is designed, I would wonder they would probably be very eager to be part of that infrastructure. And to your point earlier as well, not only become the hardware and the communications function and the connectivity function and the wallet, the platform more so. What's your thoughts on that?
I think without going to the case study, Apple tried to do a card. I think it was Goldman Sachs, came up with this Apple card. Yeah. At the end of the day, there are significant players. We've talked the US and Europe. It's large banks, and it's the current payment rails that are there driven by Visa and MasterCard today. So you have account-to-account payments, then you have card payments. And these are very significant companies that have built this whole ecosystem and the payments infrastructure, as well as the regulation that sits around it. I think a player like Apple could potentially consider, they want to take a step into that place. But I do not think that they are necessarily going to replace the major rails of Visa and MasterCard and American Express there. But I will say to you, there is space for alternative payment networks. And that's a very interesting space that we may be moving into. I'll point to a market indicator there, which was Capital One acquired the Discover for quite a significant amount. I think it was in the region of $40 or $50 billion. And that was a huge signal to the market where someone who was in a merchant acquiring business went and acquired a network or a card network, which was Discover, which means that there's appetite in the market for alternative rails other than, Visa and MasterCard and potentially American Express. But that brings us to, this whole view on there's a mobile device, which is a device, and that connects to mobile network, which is infrastructure, which is also significant, and they're big players there. Okay. Just maybe frame this, in considering the whole ecosystem is, yes, anything is possible, but telcos built networks that connected people, and that's their business. They're almost distribution. They put in this infrastructure that's delivered by big telco infrastructure players like an Ericsson or a Huawei or a Samsung, and they connect people. Now, all of a sudden, there are financial rails, or let's call it these telco financial rails, using USSD, doing very simple transactions using a USSD wallet for the big emerging economies. So you've got this convergence between these mobile networks and money. And now you've got this other technology called AI that potentially could be a really important player in making financial inclusion even more better, because you're able to do fraud scoring a lot better. You're able to do credit scoring a lot better. And it opens up a whole role of innovation in this space. And whoever's going to win there, it is very interesting how it's going to play out. What I will say to you in the big emerging markets, the telcos are playing a really important role, and we'll see more of that. You just have to look at NTN Momo. You just have to look at what EAN Group is doing in UAE. You just have to look at what's happening with EasyPesa coming out of Pakistan. You just have to look at M-Pesa, which is Safaricom. These are significant businesses. So from that perspective, I wouldn't say that, a large company like an Apple or a Samsung are going to do something there, but definitely there is space for them to play a role. You can't discount SpaceX. I just saw today that they've just bought a whole lot of spectrum, 5G, 4G spectrum for their Starlink service. So that's going to open up a whole can of worms if all of a sudden, via satellites, it's going to be very easy to connect to 4G, 5G spectrum. So maybe our friend Elon Musk is looking to disrupt that whole system also.
Sounds like it.
And there's no regulation in space.
That requires a whole other conversation, I suppose. But very fascinating, though. I wanted to move us on for the last bit of our conversation around also what's next. And as you just pointed there also of what SpaceX is moving into and what perhaps is going to come. When looking at telcos and looking at the key players and what's next in terms of the next generation, and now we're looking at agentic AI, agent-led experiences, and so forth. How do you see that will influence autonomous finance, and how do you see that will shape what's coming?
Yeah, so this is really interesting also. From what we've been speaking about, Christie, this is, in my opinion, it's about inclusion and innovation. So when you get this convergence of telco and fintech, it's about billions of people all of a sudden being connected, billions of people all of a sudden being able to transfer value digitally. So all of a sudden means you've got a digital economy at scale, okay? And you need to run that responsibly. So when you've got billions of people all of a sudden connected digitally at scale, it opens the door for incredible innovation. And AI is going to drive that innovation at scale, if that makes sense. Because banking and payments is really simple stuff. Banking and payments is all about KYC, know your customer, KYB, know your business. So once you've got that in place, banking is about taking deposits. You take a deposit, you then lend that deposit out to someone in the form of a loan or a mortgage or a business loan. You've then got payments. That's about the movement of money. You spend things, you buy things. Once you're spending and buying things, it's about, well, what things are you going to buy? So you create things to buy. It's about economies, and then economies converging with other economies at scale, And this for me is incredibly exciting because just like TCP/IP, sorry, created this incredible, network or environment called the internet. Just like mobile networks all of a sudden brought the internet onto a mobile device, we're seeing a similar kind of revolution when it comes to AI, where all of a sudden everything isn't just connected, but people, assets, value moving around this digital economy is all of a sudden in front of us, not just with a select group of people, but with billions of people coming into this digital world all across the world. So telcos aren't just these utility providers, but it's critical infrastructure for identity, for finance, and most importantly, for trust. Okay. And then if you look forward a bit, mobile wallets, this is potentially the financial orchestration layer. So they're not just catching up with banks, but they're potentially going to leapfrog into the future. That potentially could come out of economies like Africa or India, where we are seeing this. Then we talk about programmable payments.
Yeah.
What does that mean? With this Genius Act, when we're talking about stable coins, CBDCs flowing through wallets, this could potentially have the power to disrupt everything. Or, more importantly, it's going to force major players, whether it be large telcos, large banks, to start coexisting and start playing together, and that regulatory environment starts to become a bit more, encompassing of all the players in the ecosystem, including telcos, handset providers. But most importantly of all, it's going to benefit the consumer on the ground, whether it be that granny in East Africa who's now receiving some money over a very basic phone, or that young gun in India who's doing all his share trading and financial services on a really cool super app. Everything is orchestrated there, like we're seeing coming out of China.
Yeah.
So these cross-industry partnerships, which we're already seeing, banks and telcos, fintech and big tech. Okay. And I have to say, FIS, which is one of the most influential fintechs in the world today, dealing with some of the biggest banks. We're already seeing this. I mean, we've got a significant partnership with a really cool fintech like E6 or Episode 6. That's a cloud native card issuing processing company with all the fancy APIs that makes it really quick and easy to get up and running, to program all sorts of applications in a payment environment that now is becoming very, very dynamic. So we are making those partnerships cross-industry with key fintech players, whether it be fraud, whether it be AI, whether it be payments, is just accelerating across our ecosystem.
It's a mouthful, and there's so much, right? And I think it's going to be quite exciting also to see what's coming next. And it leads me to our final reflection I wanted to hear from you, Michael, before we wrap up, because of course, time is flying when you're having fun. If we were to rewire something, what do you believe needs to change over the next few years in order to really pivot?
I think everything is driven by messaging and communication. We didn't mention that. Those messaging and communication infrastructure, whether it be WeChat or WhatsApp, or whether it be coming through even Swift as a messaging platform, for example. So if there's one thing that I think that I wouldn't say that it's being made to be rewired as the wrong thing to say. I would say that it all boils down to how we are more dynamic on the regulatory environment. And that goes to whether it be consortiums being created on the fraud side. Okay. And what I could point to there is, the US, they did that quite well with early warning. The 5 big banks got together and they created a consortium. So creating consortiums around fraud and anti-money laundering that then drives regulation or works with the regulators to do that. I think that's really, really, really important. So for me, it's not that something needs to change as such, because I do think there's really good regulations in place today. But to foster innovation, there needs to be a bit more open environment where consortiums are formed to create that. What you also see, there's been a consortium or an association that's been formed on the digital wallet side. That was being driven, I think, by Terra Payments. It's also very in its infancy, okay, and maybe it's missing some of the key players, but it's a really great initiative. Someone's taken the initiative to create an association for, digital wallets. And with that, now you can start influencing regulation, you can start influencing players. We already see those associations on the payment side, but I do think markets like Europe can do a much better job. That's both with some of the key industry players, but I also think at the EU level, there really needs to be more that's done and more effective regulation driven from the EU level. I'm not saying that it's not happening, but I do think the EU should step up and should really play a more important role. I will say that from the point of view that I think, Europe has taken very much a back foot in this space because they've been a bit more differential to potentially what's coming out of the US. And I think that should potentially change. And the reason why I say that, because Europe is a perfect environment to bridge the gap between, for example, what's coming out of Africa and Europe, where there is very little regulation. We could play a very important role in bridging that gap between what we have done on, this mature market side of things to help drive the regulation, particularly with cross-border payments and that kind of thing, with these big emerging markets, India, Africa, where Europe and potentially the UK has played a really important part. So for me, what needs to change is key players in the industry need to step up, both on the industry side and on the regulatory environment and governmental side in these big markets, Europe, Asia, APAC, and India, and Africa also. And then, of course, the US, that I think with the Genius Act is actually doing some interesting stuff there too.
Michael, we have gone through a large pool of reflections, everything from good old Snake or Nokia on how we were just doing text messages to how we're now using smart devices, and they're not only just devices, they become platforms, infrastructure, significant infrastructure, and how we're living our lives and paying for everything. And then to your point here at the end, a shout out for collaboration and how could we do more together, and also in terms of regulation and your point around trust being currency. Michael, do you have any last points you want to share with the audience before we wrap up?
I would say that I'm very passionate about this stuff, but it is quite a lot to cover, Christie. Some of these points you could spend a whole hour just talking about them. But I would like to leave just one message. This is about inclusion and innovation. Wallets, or even you could say telco wallets, are bringing billions into the digital economy, which is an incredibly powerful thing, and it's really exciting. But then I would say we started talking about programmable payments. I would say tokenized money brings enterprises into real-time global finance, which is also really excitable.
Yes.
Let's just say these programmable wallets are where these two worlds are converging. So that's, for me, going to be an incredibly exciting part, whether it's the big players jumping into taking advantage of that or the really snappy startups. It's going to be a really exciting couple of years moving forward as this all emerges.
Absolutely. With that, I don't want to add anything. I just want to say thank you, Michael, so much for joining the Pantrium podcast mini-series of Rewired.
Only a pleasure, Christie. We look forward to chatting again soon.